Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon.
In this episode, I think of Alan Cohen and the song, I Did It My Way. He has lived a practice life that is, for me, quite dazzling because he has so much concern and focus and determination and all of that mixed with a whole lot of having fun and being very entrepreneurial. So as he's moving through the last few days of his career at Babson College, moving on to other new ways to be his way, I think you'll really enjoy learning about Allan Cohen. Take a moment and Google Allan Cohen at Babson College, and you'll see what I mean. He's a busy fellow and a good friend of Peter Vale and of me.
Well, this is a huge treat to have a conversation with Allan Cohen, who a moment before I turned on the recording said, Dave, Peter was my doctoral teacher as well.
No, not my teacher, is my colleague. He was
your
a doctoral
colleague.
Student. Yeah.
You were, he was a student and you were, let me get
both
this
students.
straight. Aha.
That's old.
No, wait a minute now. I don't know if my recording goes all the way back to the previous century, but we'll see. Well, tell me about that. That's a great way to get started.
Well, Peter and I came out of the same general intellectual tradition with Fritz Roethlisberger from the early studies on lighting and all that stuff.
The Hawthorne experiments, right?
The Hawthorne experiments, exactly. And Harvard Business School was not as academic as other places. And so I don't think either of us ever got a traditional scholarly background.
Thank God.
Well, that's right. I mean,
you wouldn't be anywhere near as interesting.
Well, in some ways, I wish I had it just so I could, with more authority, dismiss it. But we shared some of Roethlisberger's way of thinking about very concrete experience. But while the business school was way ahead of any other business school in terms of connecting to actual practice because of cases, they're also one or two steps removed from practice for students. That is, when you have sections of 95 people, it's very hard to do the more experiential stuff.
Sure.
And I always like to say that the problem with cases is that everybody looks alike. They're 1/16 of an inch high in black and white, and they don't talk back. So your classmates might talk back if you say something that doesn't resonate for people. But student norms get in the way there also, in terms of what people are willing to say in a high fear environment, or were willing to say. At any rate, so we shared that general background, and Peter was a year or so ahead of me. So we didn't have courses together, but we just connected from being around the place. And I don't remember exactly the direct experiences we shared, except that we got to be friendly enough so that we actually traded a few letters when I went off to India for 2 years. And a while back, looking for something else, I unearthed a letter from Peter.
Wonderful.
Yeah, which talked about some things that were going on. And then when I was looking for a job, he was at UCLA, and I was interested in it because he was there. And he basically told me how unhappy he was in California. That was the early 60s. and the world was exploding, and I think it was too immoral for him. And that I found that really interesting because it never occurred to me, because my LA was loaded with traditional family members who I was crazy about as people, but they certainly weren't on the progressive edge of any societal things. So it was sort of news to me that that's what was going on in LA. And so we had that connection that went way back. And around some early OBTC meetings, we had great conversations. I actually asked him to do a chapter in the portable MBA on vision. And by the time I asked him, his health wasn't so great. So I said, okay, let's do it together. And we combined ideas, which were quite compatible.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So anyway, that's sort of what we shared. But that's just kind of general background. So I'm glad to talk about practice for this, because I think we're saving the stuff about Peter for another meeting.
Well, we will. We'll be having a memorial session at the 47th OBTC, as we still think of it, in just a few days. But I think there's a connection, very much a connection, Alan, that you and he were there with Rollersberger, who he writes about and spoke about quite often, had a very strong influence on his wanting to essentially tack his eye down on, terra firma, to look at the concreteness, but also the experience as it's occurring with people. And one of his concerns with cases, even from then, as I recall, was they're like slices of skin. You kind of take off the skin, and after that, what about time unfolding? Maybe you guys even had some conversations with those professors back then, but that seemed to be the itch under his saddle.
Yeah, not so much. I wasn't around because I went to India and did 2 years there and ended up collecting thesis data, which was not my job or what I wasn't necessarily supposed to. And I only was back for a year. So I never had some of that quasi-peerness with faculty to even talk about it. Mm-hmm. But I was unhappy with a lot of things about the case method. And let me say one sort of archetypal thing which drove me nuts as a student. I had some professors who were considered masters. And what I slowly discovered was that they basically had a plan for the class laid out on their desk. And they were putting on the board things that students said, but it was a master manipulation, because if you didn't use the exact same language that they had in their notes, they didn't hear it or write it down.
Oh my God.
And I really resented. I came from a highly participatory undergraduate education. And so that part of the experience was great, that you got to talk in class and so on. But it turned out it was all about control for many faculty, including the ones considered the best. Mm. And that drove me nuts. Also, the school encouraged study groups, and students prepared in study groups for class. I went to 3 or 4 meetings of a study group. They were organized actually mostly around the way the bathrooms were shared. They were called can groups. And,
a little Harvard trivia that we never knew before.
There you go. So I went to 3 or 4 meetings, and I found that the meetings were all about giving you something defensible to say in the upcoming class. And members of that group and my section often prepared nothing but that. And they had one thing in case they were called on, which they would answer whatever the question was. And I wasn't a very good preparer. I hardly prepared for class because I just listened to what other people were saying. They always said a bunch of things I thought were idiotic. So I would get in the discussion to disagree.
Bust it loose.
My classmates did not like it. And faculty liked me a lot because I came close to actually talking about something.
Yeah.
And the whole focus on control, which went with what Harvard thought leadership was about then, was also incredibly irritating to me. I didn't have a very clear alternative because there was no theory at the time, except the beginnings of maybe McGregor and Theory Y. But it was just the beginnings, and it wasn't articulated, and my classmates did not share it. My classmates were all about becoming the kings of the world, which they thought the Harvard degree would entitle them to, and playing it safe so they didn't get embarrassed in class. And I mean, I was a rebel. I was the only person in my 95-man section who didn't wear a tie. Interesting, my second-year roommate was the only person in his section. We were two of the few. We found each other. And when I went looking for jobs after getting an MBA, I would go read the job descriptions that were posted along the long corridor and get sick to my stomach. They were all about really dull Midwestern manufacturing company jobs, and I couldn't imagine myself doing any of them. And my roommate was the same, and we didn't have jobs. We couldn't find anything interesting. We looked at all kinds of possibilities. And he stumbled into a job writing cases in the Philippines. And I was incredibly jealous. And then it turned out they wanted to hire somebody else. They ended up hiring 4 of us. And so I got a job case writing in the Philippines, which let me go somewhere. And
be
that
free.
experience and I got to travel around the world. And I traveled through India, and I found it fascinating. And I told the guy who'd hired us when I got back, who said, well, we're starting a project there. Are you interested? I didn't even ask what it was. I said, yes. And I went to India for 2 years and helped start Indian Institute of Management in Ahmedabad. And I was case writing again, but helping start an institution. So I got my hands into everything.
Fantastic.
And that was a totally fascinating experience. And I didn't even particularly plan to be an academic, but you got to be in the doctoral program, and case writing was a requirement. And I was having this incredibly intense experience, which was wonderful, and loved it. And so I launched my career in a way that most doctoral students didn't. And I didn't do it in a way that would have gotten me into the sort of more academic stuff. Like one of my fellow classmates was sitting around when Paul Lawrence came in one day and said, I've got this idea about differentiation and integration. Anybody like to work with me? And Jay Lorsch put up his hand and got to be part of Lawrence and all that stuff. Right.
You didn't get to tack your name on the other end of a famous guy at that point.
Yeah, so I wasn't even around for all that stuff.
Yeah.
But I also took a second-year course, which basically had a T group at the heart of it. Very un-Harvard Business School.
Yeah.
And I found that pretty fascinating and ended up going to NTL for their Applied Behavioral Science intern program. And so I was into experiential stuff right from the beginning of my academic career. Mm-hmm. And fortunately, I went to a place that let me play, and I did. And out of that, we developed the classroom as organization model.
Yeah, I love that, by the way.
Yeah, which to me is one of the things I say. That's one of the few things that I have a direct line to heaven. It came to us, and I grabbed it, and that was all accidental. A textbook publisher had approached us, and we ended up writing a book, going with the most conservative company so that the book, which was radical, might be adopted by somebody. And we articulated the method for the book and wrote the book around that, and a teacher's manual that was as long as the book, telling faculty how to use it in a way that was more experiential, where you got going in the classroom the same stuff that was in the case. And thinking about the faculty member as a leader. And in fact, it was an organization. And a whole bunch of innovations came out of that. So we were taking the basic course, which we ended up teaching to 1,000 students a year, because a lot of non-business students took the course from around the university. And, we were those crazy guys who put classes in, we rearranged chairs and put them in groups. And
you really pissed off the janitor and the accounting professor who was coming in the next morning, right?
Yes and yes, right. And
what school were you at when you started that off, Alan?
University of New Hampshire.
There you go.
I was there for 16 years, happily. I had a chair, and we were doing this course, and we had an OB group. There were like 5 or 6 of us, but we were a potent part of the program, unlike most business schools. And my wife was commuting to Boston for work, came home one day and said, I can't do this anymore. We have little kids, and it's too hard on me. You have to move or I'll quit interesting work. Well, that wasn't much of a choice.
No.
So I started looking around Boston where she was commuting to. And that's how I ended up at Babson. They had an opening.
Wonderful story. And I do remember you when you were at UNH. And I think I was just moving back into Connecticut and really trying to get my bearings around how my philosophy, or the way I like to be, could fit in and
Right.
get, on the edges at least. And the classroom as organization, certainly, I think even Peter recommended, hey, you should take a look at Alan's book. But, because Peter did track you, by the way. Somehow or another, he always, even in our
we would stay in touch. And, when I'd see him at the conferences, we'd catch up a little.
Yeah.
And, because we liked each other.
Yeah.
And that was very nice, actually.
Yeah.
Because I always looked up to him. He was a great model for what it was possible to become coming out of conservative Harvard Business School.
He, I think, probably would have sounded very much like you in regard to that feeling of springing out of there and wanting to be more expressive. And always one thing I learned from him, he wrote it in a memo to me years ago. He said, and this is after he had his accident. He said, I never quite want to finish a thought that I write about. I always want to leave it open to new possibilities, because he's too damn curious otherwise. I can't imagine then how you guys weren't soul brothers in a way, because of what I've heard from you so far and about you. I jotted down a word that I had before the call, and the word is always. Alan, how would you complete this sentence? I know this sounds like a party game, but I've always blank, blank, blank about you, your teaching, your writing, all of the things that you put together in your practice. I've always, from the beginning. Anything come to mind?
I need a whole day to probably tell the always is. Well, I always believe that business education, and especially organizational behavior, was about changing the world. And I never thought it was about filling up students' heads with theory and content. Because so much of it was lethally boring to me and not applicable. And you might be interested in the story of how Bradford and I partnered up.
Sure.
Because that's very relevant. He and a couple of guys from the Bay Area were struggling with their OB courses at Berkeley and Stanford, as we all were in most places.
Yeah.
And they decided, well, maybe they'd have a little meeting and invite 20 people from different places that might be doing something interesting to talk. And I can't remember how David heard about what we were doing at UNH, but he'd heard about it. He and I didn't know each other. So he contacted me and said, well, I'd like to come to this meeting. I said, sure. I mean, why not? And The first night, we were in subgroups talking about what's teaching and what's good teaching. And at the break, David and I happened to be in the same group. We sort of sidled up to each other at the drinks and cookies table and basically said at about the same time, do you believe what those idiots think the teaching's about? Because they were all about the transmission of content.
Yep.
How do you tell it more clearly?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, what? And of course, David was very committed to T groups and experiential stuff because of his NTL background.
Right.
You know, his father started NTL. So he was already at that. And I had gone to the Applied Behavioral Science intern program at NTL and learned more about how to be a trainer. And I already was inclined towards experiential stuff. That to me was what education ought to be about.
Yeah.
And, you know, I often laugh that I was an English major in college. And at a certain level, although you're quite removed, you aren't. That being an English major was about reading something and trying to take a position about it and talk about it and the experience of the characters and so on. So I already had practiced without knowing it. And I certainly didn't know I was going to go to business school. But so that's my first always. I always believed that my job was to transform students, to have them come out of what I taught and what we taught collectively, because I always was on my colleagues in other areas to do the same thing with modest success, some success. It was about transformation. So I always believed in that. And then everything else has been a struggle to figure out how to do it better. So that's the first thing. I was always about learner experience because I'd gone to Amherst, which I stumbled into totally by accident. And it turned out they had a remarkable curriculum in which many subjects were connected to other subjects. And they had a required first year with a couple of courses that were staggering. One course was the writing course, which we all took. And here was the weekly assignment this is a typical one. Draw a line on paper. What does it mean to write something? So it was a course about experience, about the experience of trying to transform things through words.
Express what it is to draw a line on a piece of paper.
That's right. That was your first job. Say what you did, and then okay. So the assignments were like that. And it was really a philosophy of language course. And that was paired up with some other courses, including things like physics, which was all about, here's some equipment, design an experiment, which bewildered me mostly when I was taking it. But what I realized, and this is how my mind works, I was thinking about education in a meta way. How does the collective experience of what you do add up to your education? And most faculty don't think about it that way. They think about, how do I transmit the content of my field? So I've always been struggling against that model of the world, because you can't transform people if all you do is give them information. Although that has an effect. One reason why college tends to make people more liberal is because even mediocre education exposes you to different points of view. And they're going to be different from what you came with and what your family taught you. And that starts to make you see things differently.
That the always having to do with pursuing ways to achieve transformation, have the students achieve transformation.
That's right. To have them be transformed. I was always about that, right from the beginning. And I'll tell you a funny thing. So here I was, the new hire at UNH, into a group that consisted of two other guys, both of whom were much older than I was, had come from industry. One got a doctorate at MIT, one at, where was the other one from? I can't remember. And I started teaching the required course. And about 6 weeks into my new position, I said to them, "You're doing it all wrong." Now, can you imagine the unbelievable nerve and naivete of somebody who's a new academic? Now, at the time,
no renewal for you. No renewal for you.
Well, I thought it was only staying a year because
Okay.
I had a job back at Harvard Business School, but the guy in it decided to stay another year, and I needed something to do, and I had talked to UNH. They said, "Oh, sure, come for a year." So I didn't know I was going to stay there. But to my great good fortune, both of them said, "Well, what do you mean?" And I started talking about the sequence of what we taught having to fit where learners were ready and not logical content. So don't teach individual stuff first, teach team stuff first, because in the team is where they're going to get their learning, and you got to get past their norms about how teams should work. So there I was, not even 6 weeks into it, trying to turn it all upside down. And they went along with it. And then we had this accidental thing of being asked to work on a textbook. And we said, "Yeah, well, this is more work than one person can do, so we'll do it together." And we had a team of 4 of us, because Steve Fink joined. And he was a psychologist, so he had an experiential bent also. And the 4 of us did it together. So there I was being reinforced for something that I already cared about and didn't even know I cared. I mean, as I said, I didn't plan to be an academic, but I stumbled my way into something fascinating. And of course, 2 years in India was about as great a learning experience as you could invent, for better and worse, I'm sure. But I was helping start a new management school, and you already can see how I was as a 25-year-old. I had no hesitation at knowing what the school should be about. So I was involved in curriculum stuff and working. We had 6 faculty members with American PhDs who'd been hired already, and getting involved with the way the school was run. Again, it wasn't my role. I mean, my role was to write cases, Indian cases. But I was interested, and everything was fascinating. So I was in a self-designed learning experience, and I didn't even know it. It just was happening. So that's another always. And I think a connected always was I always opened my mouth about education. I mean, some of my fellow Amherst classmates in English courses didn't like it because I was willing to talk as much as the teacher did. And when they were discussion centered, which almost all of them were, other students would keep quiet out of fear, and I'd venture opinions. And of course, it was great for faculty because there was somebody who was saying things. And I had a couple courses, one from a famous critic, Alfred Kazin, who had very strong opinions, many of which weren't backed by anything I could read in the texts. So I argued with him. And I had fellow students who didn't like that. They wanted to hear from him, not me. But that was how I learned. I've always been somebody who learned by what I said or wrote. And when Bradford and I started writing books together, the experience was hilarious. I mean, the times we'd get together, we were on opposite coasts. We'd be working for 4 or 5 hours and say, "Let's have a break." And he would go take a walk, and I would sit there, and he would come back and say, "Okay, what do you got?" And I'd say, "Nothing." I mean, just sitting and thinking about things didn't do anything for me. He would then say 10 words, and I'd talk for an hour.
There you go.
Because that's how I thought, is in the interaction. And that's always been the way I've worked. I tell students on the first day, look, this is the kind of mind I have. I'm an associative learner, so you're not going to get things in linear order. although I can be very logical, but it's not how I like to engage. And as I went along, I got more and more into, by association, talking about my experiences or experiences in consulting about what's going on in organizations. So I would link stories, and the stories were often, let's say, framed by concepts, but I never talked about the concepts except in passing. And some students were driven crazy because they wanted things they could take notes. And I would say, forget about taking notes, pay attention and engage. And then we invented courses where they had to do things.
Yes.
So one of the most fun things I've done in a long time, hard not to talk in the present, even though I'm now officially finished, or will be at the end of the summer. When I came out to San Francisco to teach in our blended MBA program, which I've been doing, I've been commuting out here. Just after I got here, somebody who'd been hired to teach, we have a program I called Semester Abroad in San Francisco, where 25 undergraduates would come out and spend a semester in San Francisco.
Almost made it to Asia, but not quite.
Yeah, right. And there were required courses only, because that were only 25 students, so you couldn't have a lot of choices. But there were 4 required courses, one of which was based on our course that's management consulting in the field with clients. So we had the parallel course that way, except here it was called Management Consulting for Technological Enterprises. And the person who had been hired to teach it couldn't do it at the last minute. So they said, listen, would you mind doing it once? I said, no, I wouldn't mind. I've often run consulting courses. So I started doing that, and I hadn't taught undergrads in years, just by the way things had worked out. And our undergraduates had improved unbelievably since the last time I taught them. And we got them clients, and they spent the semester consulting.
Wonderful.
Yeah, it was really wonderful. And
For
what
an
I would,
undergraduate.
and you'll be interested in this, what I would say to them is something that I probably always also believed in, although it took me years to get it articulated. I'd say on the first day, listen, this course is really about you falling in love with uncertainty and ambiguity. That's what you're going to learn out here. You're out here for this experience. And yes, we'll have some content around consulting, but I don't lecture about it. We have a few discussions early on about the different types of consulting, but class is you doing your consulting project, and for an hour and a half, once a week, each team will report where it's at and ask for help from the other teams, because it might be that they know something about the topic you're consulting on, and they'll learn from your experience. And then another hour and a half is reserved for a team meeting, so you can't say you don't have a common time to meet, plus whatever else you do working with your client. Incredible fun. The experience was the course. So that was the extreme form. But in our other courses, I tried to make cases as interactive as possible. Now, for a long time, I wasn't teaching a standalone OB introductory course because we were teaching in combination with other subjects. For example, we had revised the curriculum. This is something I was quite involved in, to be integrated. So the OB course was taught with managerial accounting and operations. And we shared some classroom time. We had the same teams working in all 3 subject matters. And that was something we were doing at Babson when everybody was talking about integration, but never actually doing it. We did it.
That's right.
And a lot of that happened while I was in my administrative role, and I could support it.
Mm-hmm.
So that's another kind of always.
Wonderful, always. I think of one of the things that Peter said often was, as he was thinking about that if I could have my druthers and start a school over again, what would I want to see happen? Well, one thing he said was, I want to be sure that everyone teaching those other subjects realize, even though it's called accounting, they're teaching organizational behavior. You remember
Well,
that?
absolutely. And that was something that, to some extent, we managed to pull off at Babson. To some extent. I mean, our finance guys, they're in another zone. Although they'll acknowledge that we do have something valuable, because they see that the teams don't always work so well in their courses. And so they call on us once in a while to facilitate when a team is stuck. And they know that we're pretty good at what we do. So they don't dismiss us, except, I mean, they do, but they don't in the way it happens at other schools.
Right.
And people from organizational behavior are in almost all the key leadership roles at Babson. They get to run task forces. They're called on to help on all kinds of things. It's actually a problem, because we're constantly seeking faculty who can do what we do, and people aren't trained that way in doctoral programs.
No.
So that's a real challenge.
Babson has a warm place in my heart, because I worked with Keith Rolag to create the 2008 OBTC at Babson. Right. And we brought in the plenary sessions people like Chris Argyris. I should remember them more. We brought in some of the Boston-based sort of legend guys, but we mixed it up in all kinds of ways. And I believe you were there hosting us. So
well,
that was 10 years ago, 12 years ago. My God,
we dragged in some faculty from other areas, saying, you'd be interested in some of these sessions. Why don't you come to the ones? Because it was a cheap excuse to let them get exposed to another way of doing things.
Yeah, it worked. We had a good turnout. Moving, I want to limit our time, but I don't want to limit our time. But a couple of things you said about
you could edit out any of this, by the way.
Oh no! I know
give you a license.
This is treasure. But I love a couple of things. First, by accident, this happened. By chance, that happened. By virtue of being there and not caring whether I was a newbie or whatever, I just went ahead and did. So that outgoing, that need to have fun in the best sense of fun has been very much a part of you then all this time.
Yeah, well, I was lucky. UNH was right on the edge of being a little more academic, although it wasn't an A university about research. And what I understand, although it was, of course, not openly visible to me, is, I was a controversial choice for tenure. Because people knew I was doing good things, but I wasn't writing conventional stuff mostly. I don't have a lot of rough read articles in my portfolio. I have some, but not a lot. And I didn't do any, talk about accident. What got me writing? I had a student, my first year of teaching. Turned out he was a star hockey player, and he also went to Hollywood. And he was the chief hockey player in the Paul Newman movie Slapshot. Very good-looking guy, smart as hell, nice as could be. And he was interested. And he came around one day and we were talking. He said, what have you written? Can you send me any of the things you've written? And I said, well, I wasn't writing anything, because that wasn't my main purpose. And I said, as I said, I wasn't sure I even wanted to be an academic. But it motivated me to start putting some things down. So that's another accident.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
But
I also discovered that I liked writing with other people, because you had deadlines and you got faster feedback. So, Bradford and I've often joked that if we hadn't become best friends, I would have had to kill him.
I may have to edit that part out,
No, I say it to you.
I know. You get a chuckle out of that.
It had to do with our different writing styles and stuff.
Sure.
But we wrote a lot of books together. because he would give fast feedback and I would give him fast feedback, and it motivated both of us to write and finish. So I discovered that again by accident, because a lot of people say, oh, I'd never write with anybody else. It's too hard. It is hard, but but I think for me, it's been worthwhile.
But there's a shared joy that I think that you and David manifested for and with each other. And I have to capitalize on that for the moment to say that when Peter and I started to collaborate after nearly 50 years, as a gap in a time I was his student, we couldn't stop a conversation almost, because I could feel it. And, that he would build off a word and I'd build off an idea.
Well, that's the fun. That the idea stimulate each other.
Right. And so, of course,
Dave and I invented a couple models completely out of our experiences and talking back and forth. That was our research. Well, we'd seen it in 20 different organizations.
This is the last question, because it goes back to your desire to achieve transformation with your students.
Right.
It's an awful thing to ask, but is there an Alan Cohen mark on students who are out in the world right now? Something that if I were to bump them into them, I'd think, something about you. Where did you go to school? Oh, I went to Babson. Have you had that impact? Because I think you have, but you can say yes or no.
Yeah.
And if so, what would you like to have that distinction be?
Well, I only know that I've had it when alums come back to events and tell me.
Right.
And a fair number do. And I know that I get mentioned as one of the big influences on them and so on. So there's that. And there's a whole bunch of things at Babson which, in one role or another, I initiated or supported. For example, I heard John Miller talk about the course he had developed at Bucknell, where they had students start a business.
First year business, yeah.
Yeah, and I came back to Babson and I said, this is so right for us. And I couldn't get anybody interested.
Really?
Yeah, couldn't get anybody interested.
I'm shocked.
About 2 years later, maybe 3 years later, I was having lunch with a couple friends who teach IT. And they were complaining about how bad the introductory IT course was. I mean, it was, this is a computer, this is a server. It was horrible. And they hated it. They were terrific guys. So I said, let me tell you about a course that I know about. And I told them, they got excited. They said, we'll do it as an experiment. It's now a required course for all Babson students in their first year, a year-long course where they get a lot of the content of business, which makes sense rather than making them wait till they're juniors, since that's why they came to Babson.
Of course, they want to fall in love with business early. That's kind
right.
of business.
That's right. It's very frustrating to them because it's in quite large groups, but it's transformative. And, I consider myself the grandfather of that, even though I don't teach it. So when you talk about the impact, I mean, those are things that I pay a lot of attention to. I was a big supporter of the field course. It existed before I came to Babson, but it was a small thing. I supported the hell out of it. And, some other things. So, yes. Now, the thing that I get from most students where I've had an impact is around the influence without authority ideas. Because I never, not once in the time I've been at Babson, have I ever pushed my stuff on colleagues. I didn't push the textbook, so it was never adopted. I used it, but nobody else did. I've never pushed any of my other things. I just thought, I don't feel good about that. But all my colleagues adopted at least one of the articles we did on the influence without authority model. We had an article in the practitioner-oriented behavioral science thing, when memory's going with age. Anyway, we had two versions of the article for two different editions of the book.
Influence Without Authority, yes.
Influence
I
Without
remember you
Authority.
actually presented on that at one of the OBTCs.
Yeah. So that's a powerful idea that cuts across all fields.
It's perfect for these days, too.
And I still have students who, when I see them, say, "You changed my life." I still use that. It makes a huge difference. So I get a lot of that. And of course, it starts with a mindset. It doesn't start with tools. It starts with the mindset that everybody's potentially an ally, which means you have to pay attention to what's important to them, not just what's important to you. Now that's a core concept, and it's in a lot of our OB stuff. So that's something that I know has made a huge difference for a lot of people. But we make a huge difference in our students' lives. Babson is a place that roughly has a point of view. I say roughly because there are plenty of faculty who haven't internalized it, although we're getting there. It's now called entrepreneurial thought in action, which is the notion that the way you learn is by acting, seeing what happens, and from what you learn, you modify it and you do it again. That's how entrepreneurs work, it turns out.
That's right.
And the work of Sarasvati influenced me, and then I got everybody doing it, and it's turned into a model that the school uses. Wonderful. And now all faculty, even in the liberal arts, at least talk entrepreneurial thought and action. They don't all like it because they don't always all feel so good about business.
Don't necessarily want to be it, but they'll at least talk about it. Yeah.
But the guy who's now dean of faculty, and they just added back in academic vice president, which is, I was doing the combined role, and it split afterwards. Now they've just recombined it. He's got a quasi-required optional workshop that all faculty are going through, where they're getting clarification of the model and how it applies in their own fields, and everybody learning to teach more experientially. Now that's pretty good. I never had the nerve to make everybody do it. We did curriculum stuff, but then we did it with only people.
You kept the pot warm, and then you would turn the water up gradually with that school as when you were the school leader. And
yeah,
and I think you're right. There's got to be at least 3 more of these conversations, Alan, because you have touched on so many things that certainly matter to me, and we're Peter in this right now. First thing he would say, Dave, do you think I could get a word in here?
No, we do fine with each other.
And no, he would flow right along with you on that one.
The thing is, what I worry about is that I feel like I've become a crank. I review articles for JME and AMLE, and I almost always end up saying, what this person thinks teaching is can never get them there from where they are. That they're talking about a classroom experience, but they don't see the power or potentially in it. And they're trying to write to be an A journal article, and they cut off all the interesting stuff. So I worry that I've become a narrowly obsessive person, and my patience isn't what it used to be. That's one thing that went with age. I want to get there faster and more directly now. So that's a difficulty for me, because it's so clear that what we ought to be about is what we've been talking about.
That's right.
It's so clear to me,
right,
and a few other people.
But in closing, and regretfully in closing, the point you just made, it's easy to blame the AACSB. It's a good start. We act about it for years before that my school took it on. I can tell you, in sheer honesty, I would have not been AQ qualified, given the fact that I only wanted to write what would be of interest. I wrote a novel, a business novel, instead of the usual stuff. Yep. The only reason they had to keep me going and get me all the way up there to full, and the rest, and maybe as it was always with you, I just made a hell of a difference the way I taught and how I was as a human being with students. And I was packing the room. So what are they going to do? Toss me out and bring someone in who was a linear thinker and who could line up their data set exactly with what a particular editor would accept? I'm sorry. I feel sorry for those folks now because I had a hell of a run. And actually, Peter at one point said a couple of times, he said, if I were being measured on that yardstick, I wouldn't have been able to teach in an accredited business school.
That's right. It's the same. I mean, I feel very lucky that I've been at 2 schools that valued what I did.
There you
go. At Babson, there was, it wasn't an issue. Because write a couple books that managers read, and in our school, that's a big deal. Mm-hmm. People value that. Mm-hmm. And there are places where Harvard Business Review articles don't even count.
I know, isn't that something? Yet when mine arrives, I can't wait to crack it open. So, yeah. Well, this has been absolutely wonderful, Alan, and I'm
glad I had something to say.
Oh, my Lord, yes. And I'm going to turn the recording off, but we'll stay on a moment afterwards. But thank you so much, man. Oh, my goodness.
Believe me, it's a pleasure.
You've made my day.
Thanks for listening to the Practice Podcasts, where we discuss practice with a capital P. If you'd like to hear more, listen in on Spotify, Podomatic, and Apple Podcasts, or go to inactionresearch.com/podcasts-page. And if you'd like to learn more about social inaction and the nature of practice, head over to inactionresearch.com for more information. Thank you for supporting this show. We look forward to hearing from you soon.